Hi, this is Zach from Mercury Works. I'm going to show you how to assemble a Mercury Stereo 12 lens board. Basically what this involves is adding shutters and lenses and attaching them to a Stereo 12 electronic lens board. When you first get your lens board, it will look something like this. What you need to do is, of course, purchase your shutters and lenses. They usually come together, but we'll talk about how that works for different types of shutters and lenses. There are a number of different electronic lens boards for the Stereo 12. Some of the basic ones are, this is a Copal 0 lens board. So this works for any lenses, any compatible lenses that use Copal 0 shutters. And this is a huge number of modern large format lenses. These are going to be quite common, although generally fairly expensive. These are some of the higher end lenses that you can use on your Stereo 12. This being an example. There are other types of shutters out there. The very, very popular Mamiya TLR lenses, which are these. They come in this form. They have a lens board for the Stereo 12. This is the most popular lens board because these lenses come already in stereo pairs. They're vintage lenses from twin lens reflex cameras, the C series from Mamiya, first released in at least in the interchangeable lens form in the 1960s. And these are high quality lenses. They work really well and they are extremely inexpensive to purchase, and they come in two pairs of lenses, although with only one shutter. So we'll talk about that. They require some work to get working perfectly on a Stereo 12 lens board. They're not necessarily the easiest lenses, but they are by far the least expensive lenses out there. So this is a popular choice. There's also other zero size lenses, and they use boards very similar to the Mamiya TLR lens board. These look a little different because they don't require these aperture preview ability that this adds. They don't have these notches. These notches are specifically for Mamiya TLR shutters and won't work for other zero size lenses. So, but basically there are other zero size shutters and lenses that take them. For instance, there's the Compur 0 size shutter, which a number of compatible lenses use. There's also the Seiko large format shutter that Fujinon large format lenses use. A number of excellent Fujinon lenses are compatible with the Stereo 12. And there's the Horseman lenses for Horseman medium and large format cameras. Those are also Seiko shutters, but a slightly different variety of them. Technically, the Mamiya TLR shutters are also Seikos, but because they're so different, they're made for twin lens reflex cameras. The shutters are very, very different and require this special board. Finally, there are extra small lenses. That use something called a Compur 00 shutter. And these are sort of special because they are much smaller lenses and shutters than all the other options. They make for very compact and lightweight camera setup, so excellent for travel and things like that. We have a special version of this lens board. The Compur 00 lens board can come in two forms. Either you can get the standard stereo base, which is at the distance of the human eyes, slightly over 62 millimeters, or we have another version of this lens board that actually brings the lenses closer together for close-up photography and gives you a distance of 57. So you can select either type of Compur 00 board. There's another nice thing about Compur 00 lenses, which is that they do not require any modification to the shutter at all to mount. Most modifications are quite minor, and we're going to go through them, but the Compur 00s, I'll say right from the beginning, can be assembled almost instantly with just twisting a little wire. I'll show you that later on near the end of the video when we get to the final steps, because basically for Compur 00 lenses, you can just jump to the final steps. Here's an example. One of the advantages of the 57mm spacing is that it actually makes for larger stereo slides. So your slides come out larger in width if you're shooting at a lower, smaller base. Another advantage is that you can shoot closer subjects. And closer subjects, if you like to shoot things that are very close to the camera, if you do that with a normal stereo base, it will be unfusible by the human eye. You can't go much closer than about 6 feet with a standard stereo base, but you can get a bit closer yet with this 57mm version. So for some people that's useful. The disadvantage is that you have less stereo depth at longer distances. So for shooting farther away subjects, you'll get less depth out of it. So anyway, those are options that are only available for Compur 00 shutters. There is a downside to these shutters in general, which is that they're so tiny and have such small mechanisms that they tend to require more CLA work as they age than the other shutters that I mentioned. All shutters require every 10 to 20 years a CLA. That's a cleaning, lubrication, and adjustment. A person who's familiar with that can do that for you. Basically, you disassemble the shutter and you clean out all oil, grease, debris, dust, etc., and reassemble everything fully cleaned and fully lubricated, and you adjust all the tension so that you have accurate shutter speeds. That should be done for any lens every 10 to 20 years, but these small ones, it becomes even more important. They get further out of alignment over time, and they can break a little easier, etc. So there are downsides to this, but if you want a completely easy to assemble lens board, it doesn't get much easier than the Compur 00 size. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the other types and show you how they're assembled. This is a Copal 0 lens. As I said, this is one of the most common shutters. It's an amazingly reliable, excellent, accurate shutter. They're no longer made new, but none of these lenses are made new, and all large format lenses, almost for the most part, need to be purchased used anyway, and as long as you get a very clean Copal 0 shutter, it should last many lifetimes. Like I said, with every decade or a couple decades, get a CLA. Okay, so this will often come on a lens board, a large format lens board. Sometimes it'll just come like this. Sometimes it'll be attached to a big square lens board. You will have to remove it from that lens board. So that's the very first step if you're dealing with a Copal 0 shutter. And again, I'm going to go through the Copal 0 shutter, and many of these steps are relevant for all other shutters as well, but then I'll talk about the differences of some other types of shutters and go through the Mamiya TLR shutter in particular, since that's the most complex. Okay, so to remove this lens and shutter from a lens board, if there was one on here, you would first unscrew the rear element. So with large format lenses, they have a rear element, a front element, and in the middle is the shutter. These are separate components, so it's much easier to service and CLA a large format shutter because it isn't embedded in some barrel lens. It's readily accessible. So you remove the rear element, then you're going to remove the retaining ring, and the retaining ring is what is locked tight against the original lens board. And it's the same way you're going to attach to the Mercury lens board. But to remove that, you generally use this, a spanner wrench. And what you do is you adjust it to this particular size and slot it in the notches on the retaining ring, hold down the lens board, and apply enough torque to loosen this up and unscrew it. Once it's loose enough, you can just unscrew it the rest of the way by hand. Once you remove this retaining ring, the lens board will pop off. You can keep it, sell it, throw it away, whatever you need to do. Once this is off, you are ultimately going to go in the reverse step to attach it to your stereo 12 lens board. So it's gonna go on there, and on the back you will put in your retaining ring, center it, tighten it, etc. But you can't do that yet because every shutter other than the Compur 00 requires a little bit of modification, and that is on this. And so before you do any work on the shutter, of course, you should also remove the front element, front lens element. And what you do, it just unscrews, put it somewhere safe, put it in a box so it doesn't collect dust, and this is what you'll end up with, just the shutter. Now, all you need to do to a Copal 0 shutter to make it compatible with your stereo 12 lens board is right here you have a little release lever, and this is the basically triggers the shutter. What you need to do is drill a little hole in that lever. Now, your stereo 12 comes with a little goodie bag of items. It has everything you need to do this job. And what you need, there's this, which is a little a shutter support, and there's this, which is the proper size drill bit for the hole you need to drill in your release lever. And you need to do this for just about every shutter you use, except for the Compur 00. How does this work? This little support slides right under the lever and supports it. Now, what you need to do is first mark the position on the shutter, on the release lever that you need to drill. I recommend using a Sharpie. And what you want to do is you can look at the image in our instruction guide. All of this is covered with images, detail by detail, step by step, in our assembly guide for stereo 12 lens boards. But the reason I'm showing you in this video as well is it can be sometimes be helpful to see the actual motions. Okay, so but the position, the recommended position for each of these holes for each type of shutter is shown in that guide. But mostly you want to get toward as close to the tip of the lever as you can, while still allowing there to be enough metal around it so that it has a little bit of strength and you don't risk drilling out the edge. Okay, so once you have your mark, what you need to do is you need to punch it. And that's done if you own a punch, a sharpened punch, that's what you should use. But you don't need to. You can also punch with just any good sharp screw. In order to punch this hole, all you do is you take your punch or screw and you center it on that dot you made, and you hit it with a hammer. You just hit it. Hit it pretty hard, one time only, ideally, unless you really miss. So what that does is it puts a very small, now remember, it's not going to hurt your shutter even though you're hitting it hard, because your lever is supported. Obviously do this on a hard surface, not on a carpet or something. It needs to be on a workbench or a concrete or a hard table, something hard. And when you hit this, it's fully supported by this backstop. So all of the force is just going to go into making a little dent. It's not going to bend anything. It'll just make a little tiny ding in your lever. And that is what you need to drill the hole. If you don't do that, the drill bit can wander when you try to drill. It's impossible to make it drill exactly where you need it, and you don't have room to wander here. So you need that ding in it. Once you have that, you just load this up in a drill. Now, I recommend a drill press. If you own a drill press, or if you have access to a drill press, you have a buddy who has a drill press, or you have a local machinist you want to take this job to, a drill press is the most precise way to do this, but you don't, if you're steady with a hand drill, that also works fine. You just need to hold this down, make sure you still have that support under there, and you just drill straight down. Make sure it bites in your ding before you press too hard. And if it's centered in that little punch that you made, you just drill right through. It takes like half a second to drill through this lever, and that's it. Okay, and you're going to do that for 2 shutters. Obviously, you need 2 shutters, and most of the time you would buy 2 shutters with the same 2 lenses in order to create your stereo pair. And once you have those 2 shutters, you're going to mount the shutter on your lens board. To do this, all you do is you need to know the position of the 2 shutters. So and the best way to do that, this is the proper position here. You can also look at, of course, the image in the guide, the Mercury guide. But the 2 are going to each have different positions. They're not going to be the same. Most of the other shutters will be identical pairs, but Copal 0 shutters are not. And so this goes here. And basically what you're looking at is the position of the lever. And you get it in there. And you go back here and you put your retaining ring in. One side of your retaining ring has a little lip. That lip always goes down, and it's meant to fit in the inner circle of the lens board. Okay, now you're going to get this in mostly by hand, but at some point, to get it really tight, you're going to have to use the spanner wrench again. Now, the thing to watch out for all of these shutters is as you tighten it, it might start to tighten but not be fully centered in the circle. And that's because, again, that little lip on the retaining ring, it can start to tighten around the outer circle without being inside. And so once it starts to get tight, you're going to kind of loosen it and so that it finds the center. And then you'll notice that, oh, it was getting tight. Now it's a little looser again because it's found that center, and now there's more room to tighten. And so you always want to make sure you're hitting the exact center, and that lip is going to go down into this inner circle and not get caught on the outer one. And you go in and tighten with your spanner wrench. Okay, you want to be careful that you don't turn your shutter. So the shutter needs to stay in the proper position while you tighten this. Now, I'd recommend getting both lenses in position before you fully tighten, right? Because it's easier to see the proper relationship between the 2 shutters when you have both of them in there. So for instance, you don't want this lever to be too far over, too far down, or it will hit this shutter. And similarly, you can't have any part of this shutter over on this side. So basically what you do is you get both shutters into this position, and when they're there, you go ahead and tighten pretty darn tight at that point. I would say probably as tight as you can. If you feel certain that they're in the proper position, you just tighten it up with the spanner wrench. Now, again, you wouldn't have your lens elements in here. It should just be your shutter. You don't want to risk damaging your lens elements. So you only put the shutter in for now. Once you're there, once you have your two shutters mounted, you then have to go in and add the wires. Now, the wires connect these solenoids, these actuators, to your shutters. And you have a little bit of this wire in your Mercury 12 goodie bag. And basically what you do is there's a little hole at the end of each of these, and you're going to string the wire in it, wrap it around once or twice to make a good solid connection, and then you're going to run it up, or you're going to run it to the proper place. In this case, the wire actually needs to go through, for this Copal shutter, it needs to go through this guide. So you're going to go in here, and it really helps to have pliers. And you're going to grab this wire, and you're going to feed it through. This can be challenging. This is one of the Copal Zero's slightly more tricky of a wire. The wire is very straightforward on other shutters, but with a Copal Zero, because it has this little guide you have to go through, it gives you less room to work in. But basically, you guide it through. And then, as I said, you twist it around. And you can rotate this little arm in order to help you do that. Okay, so I have it bent around that arm. And it's coming out this side, and what this will now connect to is this shutter, your shutter over on the left. And what I want to show you is it's really helpful at this point when you're ready to connect to the lever. You're going to connect it through that hole. Now, this wire can fit through the hole that you drilled. However, it is easier if you take the end of the wire and you strip it. And you just strip a little bit on the end. I'd say maybe a little more than that. This is 22 gauge wire. And now you string this up through the hole that you drilled, and you bend it back down again. So you're basically just going up through the hole, bending it back over, as you can see here. And when you do that, you're basically creating a situation, and you can actually pull this and see that it's pulling that wire. Now, two things. One is the distance here. You want to make sure you're not pushing this all the way in. You got to make sure that it's out. This one could actually be extended a little bit more. I could adjust this, pull it in a little more, a little tighter, because you want there to be some play between when this is all the way out, when this piston is out, and when it's in. And when it's in, it should pull this lever. And when it's out, the lever should be fully back at rest. It should never be partially pulling the lever. That's when you're adjusted properly. Letting go of the solenoid will allow this to return back to its resting point completely, not partway here or something. Now, to test your lens board, once you have connected and adjusted your wires, and you think everything looks good, and the key that you have the right play between your lever at rest and the resting point of the solenoid piston, and you can pull the lever all the way to its end point, also within the movement of the piston. That means you should be adjusted correctly, but you always then want to test, of course. To test, you just put in the camera and plug in a lens board. No need to mount it with the bolts or anything like that. All you do then is cock the two shutters, trigger it, and make sure that it worked. If it did, everything's good. If for some reason one of the two shutters does not trigger, then you need to again look at your play, decide maybe your wire is too loose and you need to pull it tighter. Pull a little bit more of the wire so there's less wire separating the two. Just wrap a little bit more around either of the ends. Or possibly your wire is too tight and your lever is not getting all the way back to the resting position before it gets pulled. So that's basically the troubleshooting for if for some reason one of your shutters is not firing when you trigger it. Okay, this is a Compur Zero lens board, and these are Compur Zero shutters. So unlike the Copal Zero, these are a little bit older. They are amazingly well-made shutters, require CLAs a little bit more often, but should go basically forever. These are very similar. The first step is to drill those little holes on the ends of these shutter actuator levers. But you'll notice these are a little bit thin. It's a little bit slightly more of a challenge to drill that hole in there, but it's certainly quite doable. And secondly, some Compur Zero shutters require some modifications in addition to drilling the hole. Specifically, ones that are branded Graflex. These were made for the Graflex XL camera system, and for our purposes, they have the aperture levers up here on the wrong side. By default, they're down at the bottom of the lens near these. Now that's no good. That gets in the way. You can't see it. It doesn't work well for the Stereo 12. So you have to swap it to the top side. And the detailed instructions for that are in our instruction guide. It does require a little bit of filing or grinding or dremeling. There's a number of different ways you can do it, but basically you just have to remove a few screws on the back of the lenses, and you're going to then pull out the aperture lever or aperture ring. It's a ring, and you're going to have to grind off something, and you're going to have to add a little notch. It's very easy to do, but that might give some people heart attacks. The fact that they have to modify something on the shutter, but you don't have to take the whole shutter apart. It's the first thing that comes off. I don't think it's actually that challenging, but you should be aware that Compur Zero shutters, if they're Graflex, require a swapping. If they're not Graflex, there's still another slight modification you have to do. So they're definitely a little bit more work than a Copal Zero shutter. However, they're excellent. And sometimes these lenses, which are sometimes a bit older, sometimes they're the only option for particular lenses. Like this, probably the most amazing 80 millimeter lens that I would recommend for this camera is the rod and stock Heligon lens from the 60s. It's incredibly sharp, incredibly fast, and distortion free. Amazing lens if you can find one. Often came on Graflex cameras, Graflex XLs. Okay, but there are other lenses that use Compur Zero shutters that are not the Graflex variety. They're easier to modify a little bit. Anyway, great shutters, a little extra work. This is a generic Zero Lensboard is what it's called, and it accepts these Compur Zero lenses. It also accepts Seiko Zero shutters from Fujinon large format lenses and from Horseman medium format and large format lenses. So there are a number of great compatible lenses that use this board. It's the simplest board. There's less really to do, but the Compur shutters require just a tiny bit of work. Once you're on here, as you can see, the wire hookup is actually much simpler than with the Copal Zero board. All you need to do here, again, you just take the wire that comes in your Stereo 12 kit, and you're going to cut very short length of this. Again, I recommend stripping one end of each wire to make it go through and connect to the shutter trigger lever easier. You can do it without, but it can be a little more frustrating, so you can just strip that if you have a wire stripper, or just with a pair of wire cutters, or even, you know, a X-Acto knife or a knife or something. You can, whatever you've got available, you can use to strip this. Okay, so what you're going to do, you just need a small little piece of wire. And again, the trick here is to figure out which side you're going to connect first. But you just go through here and around, and I think even that's too long. And you can twist this around and connect it on the other side, bend it up, and you're going to get something like that. Very simple. Takes just a few seconds to do that, and you do that for both sides. And again, just like the Copal Zero, the key to adjusting this is that you get full lever movement in the range of motion of the piston, enough to trip the shutter, right? And at the same time, that this is able to go all the way back to rest. So you can test this as you do it just by cocking the shutter, seeing if it trips. In this case, it's not tripping. It's not going quite far enough. So we need to shorten this wire. Now to do that, we're going to have to create our bend a little tighter. Okay, so now that seems to work. Again, this is just the basic you use for any shutter on a Stereo 12. You want to make sure that it trips within the range of motion and that it can return to its resting point. That's what you're doing. And to adjust that, you just adjust the amount of wire in between the two devices. Shorten it, pull it tighter, or loosen it, let it out a little bit. Okay, once that's done for both shutters, again, you just put it on the camera as I showed with the Copal Zero, plug it in, trip it, make sure that it's working. If it instantly triggers both shutters when you press the trigger on the camera, you're good to go. If not, adjust those wires a little bit. Now I should say that every once in a while, these wires need to be slightly readjusted if they get banged around a lot. If you're traveling, your camera's in a bag, the wires get a little bent or pulled or whatever, or just through use you didn't wrap these tight enough and they start to kind of elongate over time. You may need to tighten them up on the spot. You may need to even at some point, you know, redo them if they keep getting loose. So they should be pretty consistent, but they can get perturbed by by things banging into them or prolonged use if you just didn't wrap them enough, and they're kind of pulling the wires out of their position. So it's important to have enough wrapped around both sides to keep them tight, and then you should be good forever. On to Mamiya TLR lenses. Since these are so cheap and come in stereo pairs already on a Mamiya TLR lens board, that's what this is, they are a very popular choice. Now, remember, you need 2 shutters to set up a stereo 12 lens board. One of these sets, a Mamiya TLR lens set, comes with 2 lenses that are identical, but only 1 shutter. The other lens was meant for it to be a viewing lens, and it's in just basically a shutter spacer. It's the same spacing as a shutter, but it doesn't actually, it doesn't do anything. And so you're going to need 2 shutters. So what does this mean? You need to buy 2 of these in order to have the 2 shutters you need for your stereo 12 lens board. Now, the popular choice here is to get 2 different focal lengths of lenses, because you'll end up with 4 lenses and 2 shutters. And when you set this up on a camera, you can actually, you leave the shutters in your lens board, but you can change the lens elements. You just unscrew them front and back and put new ones in, and you can change lenses just like that. That's a popular thing to do. So for instance, if I were to want to set up a stereo 12 lens board for TLR lenses, I might buy a 55 millimeter lens and an 80 millimeter lens, or a 65 millimeter and 105 millimeter, or whatever combination you like. I recommend the 65 because that's, I think, the best focal length, but the 55 millimeter is an amazing lens. The 80 millimeter is a really good lens. So you can get whatever 2 lenses you want, basically, on 2 different lens boards. So it's kind of like getting 4 lenses for the price of 2. And they're all very cheap compared to higher-end large format lenses. Okay, so the problem is this will require some more effort. Again, it's not difficult, but you'll have to do a little bit of work here. First of all is disassembly. To disassemble from the lens board, it's very similar to the Copal Zero lens that I showed you. Basically, you go in with a spanner wrench and you get in there and you loosen it up until it's loose enough. But I will say that sometimes that works really well. Sometimes these Mamiya TLR lens boards, they're incredibly tight. If they're really, really tight and you can't get it, you don't want to get too dangerous here. Now, I should say, of course, you should always remove the lens element before you remove the retaining ring, because you don't want to damage those. So you want to remove both of those. But if you find that they're difficult to remove, either the rear elements, which can sometimes also be screwed in incredibly tight from the factory, or the retaining rings, which can sometimes be screwed in really tight, if you can't get the leverage you need with the spanner wrench, you can use this. And these are called channel locks. And if you get like 12-inch channel locks, this is not a very expensive tool. I've got a real old one here that is used for plumbing, but easily orderable online or at your local store. You want one that has, see how it's curved jaws. You want curved jaws because that provides the most support against your lens element or retaining ring. You need to apply pretty even pressure, or what happens is you're bending the metal, pushing part of it against the threads and making it harder to remove. So actually, you adjust this to the right size. You want to make sure that it's touching in multiple places on the jaws, and then you just crank it until it's loose enough to remove. Same with the lens element. If that's really tight, as this one actually is, you just go in there and you loosen it. You got to grip it real tight so you don't scrape the paint on the lens, or the anodizing actually, but you loosen it up and then you can remove it. Once you get to that point, you can remove the retaining rings. Now the retaining ring for the shutter and the retaining ring for the spacer are identical rings. Okay. Now you'll notice that you can't fully detach the shutter because it's connected by a wire. You can remove the spacer. Okay, so what you need to do is actually then you'll find 4 little screws on here, and you need to remove those screws. Once you've removed those screws, this entire plate will come loose. Now, you can save this plate because remember, once you have 2 sets of these lenses, you're going to have 2 of these extra little spacers. You can remount those spacers back on this plate as a place to hold your second set of lens elements, right? You can put your new lens elements in this and have this for when you want to change lenses using the same shutters. So useful to keep this and these spacers and the retaining rings, but you don't need those for the moment. Now you're going to end up with some stuff that you can get rid of, and sometimes you'll end up with these spacers. You can keep these spacers on here and use them on the Stereo 12 lens board in order to try to retain the original little shimming. These are shims that the factory use, or you can get rid of them and test it without and see if your lenses match, which they usually do. It's up to you. So, or you can make a note as to which shim was on which shutter. You can experiment with it later. That's these shims. Okay. The other thing that you'll find now is that you've got this kind of big metal thing hanging off your lens, and it has a wire on it. Now this is your flash. Downside to this shutter is it does not have the flash port on the shutter itself like Copal Zero, Compur Zero, and just about every other shutter on compatible lenses has. These TLR lenses has it on the side. Now you have to make a decision. Do you want to retain flash sync ability? Because if you do want to retain flash, the ability to use flash with the Stereo 12, you're going to want to keep this wire and port intact. If you don't care, you can just snip the wire. Now, I would never recommend snipping it all the way at the edge. I'd always leave a little wire because maybe you'll change your mind in the future, right? Or someone else will want to use flash with it. So it's good to keep the wire intact and maybe just snip it, somewhere over here if you decide you don't want to use flash. That still opens up the possibility that you could reconnect the wire at a later time. If you're sure, though, that you don't want it, that's what I would do, if you think you're sure. If you do want it, you've got to go through some extra steps. And what you're going to need to do is use a very small flathead screwdriver. Usually. Some of these have Phillips screws. Most of them I've encountered have little flathead, flathead screws. And what you need to do is get in there and remove these. First, you need to remove these 2 on the flat disc where the port is. Once you've done that, you can pull this port forward a little bit and pull the wire through to give yourself some space. And then once you have a little bit of space, you remove the 2 at the foot of this port. Those have to come off second once this top part is kind of pulled away. Once you've removed the foot, you can then reattach the 2 screws that hold these 2 parts together. So these 2 screws can go back on, then you have a full assembled unit with its foot, but no longer attached to this thing. Now, unfortunately, to get this wire off of this metal part, the way they assembled it at the factory is they ran the wire through and then soldered it at the back of this pin. To get it out of there, you need to either break the wire or desolder it and pull it through and resolder it, or you need to cut this metal piece. If you don't want to do any soldering and unsoldering, what you need to do is you need to get in here with a file or with a Dremel and a cutoff wheel and very slowly, very carefully chop out, cut a little channel here in this metal down to the point where you liberate this wire, and the hole is a little bigger than the wire, so you can't, it's possible to do that and get in there and open that hole up and then just boop, pull the wire right out of there. And this whole unit will be intact, just kind of hanging off of your shutter connected by a wire, and you can reattach it to your lens board. So that's the method I recommend, is keeping all this intact and just chopping a little path in this piece of metal, which is you're going to throw away. It has no use. But you can nick the wire, but even if you do, you're no worse off than if you had broken the wire or desoldered it. You'll have to resolder it anyway. So I recommend just chopping that out of there. But if you're handy with a soldering iron, you're like, I don't want to spend all that time cutting the metal, you just disconnect it and then you can resolder it. Very carefully resolder that wire onto that point. Mamiya TLR shutters, besides drilling the hole in the release lever, require a couple of other modifications. For one thing, by default, the aperture range of the shutter is limited by this ring on top. And because you're going to be using, most likely, two different shutters that were originally intended for two different lenses, you need to fix that so that both have their full range of motion. That's not just for lens compatibility, but also to be able to fix a new aperture scale to the lens, which we'll cover in a minute. That requires full aperture range of motion. So to do that, you've got to take this, there's a little ring right at the top of the shutter, and you've got to pry that out. And it's pretty easy. You can usually do it with a finger, but if not, you could use a little a flathead screwdriver or something, get it in there and pop it out. This ring on the back has little tabs. Now normally this one's already been modified, but these tabs stick in to the center, and sometimes there's one, sometimes there's two. And what you need to do is remove those tabs. Those tabs are what are physically preventing the shutter from opening and closing the whole range of its aperture. You can do that in one of a couple of ways. Now, first of all, I should say this. If you don't want to modify this ring at all, you can just get rid of it. If you get rid of the ring, you now have full aperture motion already. When you put your lens back in there, your lens element, you're going to end up with, just a gap around the edges. The main purpose of this ring, it's aesthetic. If you want it to look as best as it can look, it should have the ring in there. Also, the ring probably prevents a little bit of dust from being able to get inside. Probably not a huge deal, but could be for you. So personally, I think it's worth modifying the rings, but if you don't want to do that, you can just remove the ring. To modify the ring, you just go in there and you can cut off the tab and then file it with a diamond file, or you can use what I do with a Dremel with a cutoff wheel, and you just go in and zip off the little tabs sticking inward. And you can probably see in here the little silver edge where I have removed the tab by cutting in there. And you want to end up with a nice round circle with no jagged edges and whatnot. When you do that, you can just pop it back in. However, there's one more step. Some Mamiya TLR shutters have a smooth aperture. You can just smoothly open and close it. Others, and this is most of them, have click stops. And that means that click, 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 there's a tiny ball bearing inside that clicks you into little half stop aperture stops. Now the problem with that is it has to be calibrated to a particular lens. And since we're changing lenses, and again, none of this applies if you were to buy two lens boards of the same lens, use the exact same shutter, just like you would with a Copal Zero or Compur Zero, all those large format lenses. You have to buy two of them. Well, if you bought two of the same thing for Mamiya TLR, you could ignore these steps. However, most people buy two, as I mentioned, two different types of lenses to get their two shutters, and thus their shutters are not matching, but they do have two matching pairs of lenses, and that way you get twice the number of lenses for your money, but you have to do these modifications to make all the shutters compatible with all the lenses. So you got to get rid of those click stops because they won't match different lenses, only the one that it was assembled for. To do that, I'm not going to go through the process here, but to do that, what you do is you remove these three screws, and you get in there and remove this inner ring, and under there is a little ball bearing on a tiny little spring, and you just remove that and put it back together in exactly the same way that you took it apart. You're not getting into the mechanism of the shutter. This is still before you get into any of the mechanism, but you do need to be a little careful that you replace the same screws in the same places. There's a little there are little washers under there. Anyway, those instructions are in our guide, our written instructions with photos. It's not hard to do. You just carefully remove the stuff. You pull out the ring inside, find the ball bearing, get rid of it, assemble it back how it was, and then then you'll put this back in again. This does go in a particular way. Just there's a particularly deep cutout that goes around what's a particularly long screw in there, but that's easy to see visually, or you can just mark it with a pencil before you remove it and line it up again when you go back, and that just literally just presses back down in there. Once you've done those two things, your lenses or your shutter is fully compatible with every lens in the Mamiya TLR lineup. Okay. I should also mention that you can do the same thing with the older silver shutters or the black shutters. These older Mamiya TLR silver shutters work great as well. I wouldn't recommend mixing and matching the two of these. Either get two silver shutters or two black shutters. Also, there are different kinds of black shutters in terms of the handles. The blue dot ones here, much lauded. It just means they're newer. They aren't any better. Before that, there's a black dot, and before that, it's just a silver handle. They all work the same way. They look a little bit different. So if aesthetics matters, you can get two that are the same. But all black shutters work the same way, and all silver shutters work the same way. Just one or the other. Silver has slightly different requirements. It does not need the anti-clicking, so it's declicking. So they're a little easier, but they're also older shutters and slightly harder to drill that hole because they have a real narrow point at the end here. But it's trade-offs on all these. Most people go with the black shutters because they're newer. But either if you can get real bargains on silver ones, and maybe they need CLAs, probably they do, probably all of them do. Then they'll be great. They're high quality shutters, just like the black ones. Okay, so once you've done all of that, there is another step, which is that if indeed you've got two different shutters from two different lenses, you're going to need to replace the aperture scale. Now, if you're going to use multiple lenses with the same pair of shutters, which many people do because you can buy the two sets at least, or buy more if you want, you may need an aperture scale that has markings for multiple different lenses. And we make those. You can just download them from the Mercury Stereo website, and they look something like this. And you can print them out on anything you want, but I'd recommend printing them out on adhesive vinyl sheets. Those make for the best scales. Won't leave any residue, won't leave any damage to your shutter. So what you're going to do is basically what you do. Now, this already has a modified scale on it, but what you do is you're going to move this aperture. Now notice as you move it that you're lining up with the little red dot. This one hasn't been modified yet, but when you modify it to get full range of motion, it may go past the engraved scale, or it may end at one side of the engraved scale. But either way, what you do is you turn this aperture dial all the way to one end, and again, it has to be declicked. It has to have its full range of motion. And what you do is then you mark with a little line where on that rotating part is its end of its motion. And then you go all the way to the other end and you mark that end of its range of motion. Then you can adhere the scale. Again, if you've printed it out on adhesive. Now, we have different versions that have different sets of lenses. This one has the 65 millimeter lens and the 55 millimeter. We also have one that has the 55 and the 80, and we have one that has all four of the common lenses for the Mamiya TLR system, all in different kind of colors. So choose which one fits your situation, which lenses you plan on using. Okay, so what you're going to do now, this does not have its full range of motion, but when you do have your full range of motion, you'll notice that these little gray lines on our printable scales, hopefully one of the two sets of lines, there's an inner set and an outer set, and there are two different scales. The blue dot, the little blue dot on the handle, the blue dot ones use the outer two. Other black shutters that are not blue dot will be closer to the inner lines. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect the operation of the aperture. They both have the same range of opening. They just have a slightly different gearing mechanism there. Anyway, what you're going to do is try to line up the gray line with your pencil line. And you're going to do that for both sides. Just look at both pencil lines, and you're basically going to center it. If it's slightly off it doesn't perfectly line up, that's okay. You're going to look for the closest alignment you can, and that's where you're going to adhere your scale. And you just do that for both lenses. And now you have a totally new aperture scale. We align it differently. We make it more visible. We color code it for multiple lenses. So it should be a superior aperture scale for use on the Stereo 12 camera. And of course, it's versatile. And you can always peel it off and put a different one on, or make your own. You could do whatever you want with these aperture scales. But that's how you do it. That's how you add multiple lens aperture scales. Now, I should say that you can also do that to any of our, to many at least, of our other compatible lenses that use different shutters, like Copal Zero. We have a lot of Copal Zero shutter scales, aperture scales, and we have a lot of some other lenses like Compur Zero lenses as well. What that does is allow you to, once again, combine have multiple lenses even on those other shutters, or just you can use shutters that don't have the proper aperture scale, and we give you the aperture scales for whatever lenses are compatible. So all those are downloadable from mercurystereo.com. Once you get to the stage where you're ready to mount your shutters on the lens board, it's just a matter of the shutters have a it's hard to see. You'll notice there's two little notches in the circles on the Mamiya TLR lens board. The other lens boards don't have these notches, but what the purpose of the notches is to enable, basically there's a little screw in the bottom of the shutters, and when you rotate it until you feel until that little screw goes into the notch and locks in place. And then you only have a tiny bit of motion left on your shutter. It's pretty much locks it in the proper position, so it's very easy. And both shutters go in the same position, unlike the Copal Zero, like the Compur Zero, and etc. You just lock it in place. And once you've done that, you just like any other board, you go ahead and you go in there and you're going to use the spanner wrench to make it extra tight. Once you've done that for both shutters, you go through the same process of connecting the wires and testing it out on the camera that I already covered with the Copal Zero, right? It's the same Copal Zero and Compur Zero shutter. Very simple and similar for that step. There's only one other thing I need to mention for the Mamiya TLR lenses, and that is again the flash. Once again, all the other shutters that have flash sync it's on board the shutters, and so you just connect your flash to one of the two shutters. It's really easy. It's only these Mamiya TLR ones that have this separate dismounted unit that we talked about when we took this off the board. Now, it may look like this is ready to fire, but it actually isn't. If you want to use the flash on one of these lenses, you actually have to connect a second wire to this. That's what's so strange. Now, it's because it doesn't have a ground wire. In the initial, this is really crazy, but Mamiya's idea to kind of make it, to simplify things and cut costs, was to use the original Lensboard, which is made out of metal, and when tapped through the anodizing makes an electrical connection. They're using the Lensboard as the ground for the entire flash circuit. That doesn't work on the Stereo 12 Lensboard because it's actually a plastic substrate, not metal. No electricity is going to flow through it. So what you need to do is add a ground wire. And again, this is really optional. This is only if you're going to use flash on the camera with these lenses. I should also say you only need to do this with one of the two lenses, although if you want to preserve the flash on both, that's kind of a good fail-safe. This is an example of one I already did, and I won't go into much detail here, but there are illustrations and explanation for this in the Lensboard assembly guide. But basically, you add an extra wire, and you can use the exact same wire that came with the camera, the same wire that you use to connect the solenoids to the levers, trip levers. And you just need a little length. What you do is you strip the end and you sandwich it between these two parts that you unscrewed when you disassembled this from the Lensboard, the Mamiya Lensboard. You stick it in there and then tighten up the screw so you've got a piece of metal sandwiched in there, as long as it's not touching this the back wire where it's soldered. And then you run that wire in and you take out one screw that's holding this metal aperture scale in place. You take out that screw, you strip the end of the wire, you wrap it around under there and reinsert that screw underneath. You can't really see it here, but and that's now what you're doing is you're making an electrical connection between the body of the shutter under the scale there and the frame of the outer frame of your flash sync port. Now, if you've made a good connection, it will now work, which is to say when you fire this, if you want to set it to X, it generally has an X and an M, but anyway, you set it to X sync, and it will, when you fire the shutter, it will send a signal to the flash port, and that will fire a flash if you connect a flash to it. So that's what you have to do. But once again, you could leave that for later. You can just assemble your board, get it working, and only if you later decide you really want to add flash capability you could add that ground wire at a separate time. Now, the actual little flash foot with the port, there is a space on the Lensboard where there's no vinyl No leatherette here where it's meant to glue on there. You could choose a different place to glue it. It's up to you. But what you can do is just take it to that the wire over to that glue spot. I've actually got screws here. You could also like add little screws and screw it in there, but they have to be self-tapping screws, not the original screws that you removed from that are machine screws from the original Mamiya board. But you can just glue it. Now you can use hot glue to do a quick temporary fix. See if you like it. A better glue is a rubber, like a rubber cement or E6000 glue. But basically you can just glue it in place. When you're done, you've done all of that, you end up with something like this. And you can see here I've got, I haven't added the ground wire here, but I do have the flash sync port in position. And actually this one, I have a second flash sync from this. And every once in a while you'll get the newest version, the latest version, the last version Mamiya made of these lenses. Even though the lens is similar, it has a different kind of sync port with a different kind of foot. The whole thing, it works this exact same way. You remove it same way, and you still have to add a ground wire if you want to actually use it. But in this case, I've just glued the two in there so they're ready to go if I ever in the future decide I want to add a ground wire to one of them and actually use flash with this particular lens. Now, that's a consideration if you really want to use you use flash all the time. You want to do flash medium format stereo photography. You might want to just go with a different type of lens. Lenses that have the flash sync built in, like any pretty much any other shutter type other than the Mamiya TLR. That might be a consideration for you. But if you want to do it with the Mamiya, you certainly can. Final step, as I've said before, is to just add these wires. And the wires are just like everything else. You bend the wire through the end. You bend it. You put it through the hole in the solenoid. You bend it around, and you set it so that you have so that at rest the wire's long enough so that when the solenoid's at rest, it will allow the lever to move all the way back, and when the solenoid gets pulled, it will pull the lever all the way forward. However, unlike those other boards that I showed you and with other types of shutters where you could test that, you could see the full range of motion, the strange thing about these Mamiya TLR lenses is that you actually can't pull this lever all the way forward if the shutter isn't cocked. So you can't kind of dry pull it. You need to actually fire it. And so what you need to do is every time you test it is cock the shutter, test the range of motion, make sure it goes all the way back and goes all the way forward to trip all within the range of motion you've given it. If it doesn't, you need to lengthen the wire or you need to shorten the wire between the two, just like any other board, but it's a little bit more of a pain to test because you have to actually cock it in order to test that range, unlike all the other shutters. The only other thing that's different about Mamiya TLR is besides the sync port, flash sync, not being located on the shutter itself, and that modification of the declicking and the aperture range. The other thing that's strange about these is that they do not have an aperture preview mode. Now, aperture preview mode is when it just opens the shutter and you can set the aperture to whatever you want. And that's how you use ground glass. So if you're going to shoot, you don't need that when you're shooting handheld, but when you're shooting with a viewfinder, but when you shoot with a ground glass back and you want to see your image previewed on the camera before you shoot, which is really great. That's one of the great advantages of the Stereo 12 is that you can see your exact shot as it's going to be exposed, the exact framing of both lenses, both eyes. To do that with the Mamiya TLR lenses, there is no mode. All the other shutters have, or most of the, not all, Compur 00 shutters don't have this either. But most of the other shutters have a preview mode. You just press a lever, press a button, whatever you need to do, and it puts it in preview mode. Mamiya TLR lenses don't, and so we've built that functionality into the lens board itself. That's what these little brass threads are for. And you'll notice inside the lens board, there are also brass threads that hold, and these are just where to store these little preview screws. When you're traveling, or you don't want to lose them, or you're just not going to use ground glass for a really long time, you can just keep them on the inside of the board. But when you want to actually do a aperture preview for ground glass or whatever, what you do is you actually insert these into here, and just a little ways. And what you do is you trip your shutter. Okay, so you put your shutter on B for bulb. There is a bulb mode, not a T mode, which could also be used for preview. But anyway, you put it on B for bulb, and cock your shutter, and then you trip it. And you can do that electronically, or you can do that manually here by just pressing the piston. You trip it, but you hold it down, and you screw this in. Now it will hold you in bulb mode, and you can then fully operate the aperture and probably open it up all the way. If you are using ground glass and you'll get an image on the ground glass, you can focus, you can check your critical framing, you can do whatever you need to do, and then when you're ready to resume normal operation, you just loosen this until it clicks back closed again. Okay, and you can leave these here, but they can get loose and fall out. So for long periods of time, in between shoots or whatever, I'd recommend putting them back on the back side of the board. I have just two final notes about Mamiya TLR lens boards. One is that, and they're peculiarities of a couple of different lenses. The 65 millimeter lens is a kind of strange lens, and this is actually my most recommended lens for just a basic, if you would only have one lens, I'd use the 65. That's the focal length I would use for any type of shutter as my first choice, although there are, of course, much more exotic lenses out there. But 65 is just a great general purpose lens, probably the best focal length, in my opinion, for medium format 3D. Most versatile. Okay, so two things are strange about the 65 millimeter in particular. One is that it has no markings. It does not have any markings inside, which is strange. Secondly, it is sometimes comes with a silver thread adapter that you need to remove for lens filter thread adapter. Strange. Third is this. And this is the annoying part. It has this strange little extra plastic piece here. I don't know if you can see that. It's a piece that actually goes around each lens and connects the two lenses. In all the other Mamiya TLR lenses, the two are separate on here. One is in a viewing spacer, one is in a shutter, but they're independent of each other. The 65 has this extra piece that yokes them together. Very strange. To remove this, it's just one extra step in the process of disassembling this from the Mamiya lens board. What you need to do is, normally most of these lenses have a single front element that you just remove from the shutter and the spacer. The 65 has two parts to its front element. So basically it has two lens elements in the front that thread together, and you need to unthread the top one, so on each side here. So this part, that will come off on both sides, and then what you're left with is this plastic ring. To get rid of the ring, there are set screws. There are 4 set screws. You can see these little holes here, 2 on that side, 2 on that side. You need to get a very, very, very small flathead screwdriver, like a jewelry repair, or one of these iFixit kit screwdrivers, etc. You get a tiny little flathead and stick it down in there and unthread that set screw. It's possible that it will be stripped, it won't come out, it'll be locked in place. If that's the case, you need to just find a way to break this plastic. You can cut through it, file through it, use a Dremel to cut through it. It might mar the outside of your lens a little bit, but if you're careful, you can do it and just pry this thing off. But if you're lucky, you can actually just get those set screws out. Once those 4 set screws out, this thing just lifts off the top of the 2 lenses, and it's gone. Once you've done that, make sure that you you add your front element back onto your lens. Reassemble your front element, the 2 front elements together. Other than that, it's exactly the same as any other set of shutters. But I showed you this one last just because it's an anomaly. There's one other anomaly, and that's with the one version of the 105 millimeter lens, the DS version. The 2 are not, these are identical in form and for every other lens, but the 105 DS version, they're different. Optically, they're identical, these two lenses, but the housing is slightly different. One is normal with the normal barrel. The other one has an aperture, like an aperture preview. To remove it, you can't just unscrew it from the spacer here. You need to actually use a spanner wrench on 2 internal points. That's all covered in the instruction guide. That's weird in terms of aesthetics and functionality, although optically they are the same. For that reason, though, your 2 lenses won't really match, and they won't come out and in easy as all the other Mamiya TLR lenses if you're swapping different lenses into the same shutters on the same board. So those are 2 special pieces of information to be aware of when you're looking at these Mamiya TLR lenses. I'll now cover just a couple of other shutters. We've already talked about the Copal Zeros, the Compur Zeros. Just as a quick recap, the Compur Zeros, and if you're scared by any of this, the Compur 00, as I mentioned, requires the least amount of assembly. It requires no modification. You don't even have to drill the handles, because on these lenses, the handles have little nubs on them, and this is true of both the Angulon 65 millimeter and the Super Angulon 65 millimeter. The 2 different lenses that use this, that are compatible with the Stereo 12 and use the Compur 00 shutter. Both of these have this little nub, and what you do is you connect these wires the same way you do for all other lenses, but instead of going through the hole you drilled, you just wrap it around the lever on the inside of that nub. And the nub, if you do it tightly, then the nub prevents the wire from slipping off, so you don't have to drill it. It just works, and that's all you have to do. The other kind that we didn't really look at is there's the Horseman shutters require a slight modification. The Horseman Seiko shutters, those use the generic 0 sized board. The other lenses that I mentioned are the Fujinon Seiko shutters that are a little bit different from the Horseman Seiko shutters. Excellent lenses. The Fujinon 65 and the Fujinon 75 are both compatible with the Stereo 12 and are just fantastic, amazing lenses. Lightweight, compact, extremely sharp and high quality. But the Seiko shutter, the Seiko large format shutter that they come in for Fujinons, does require a tiny bit of modification. This is the only kind of aesthetically destructive modification required for any shutters on a Stereo 12. One shutter goes in completely the same. Well, actually, you have to flip on all these shutters. You have to, on these Seiko Fujinons, you have to flip the aperture ring. I mentioned with the Compur 0 Graflex version, you have to flip the aperture lever to the other side, which requires a little bit of modification of that lever, and you have to detach it and flip it and put it over there. You have to do that for these 2. But in addition, you have to, on the right side, shutter, you have to do a little bit of grinding or cutting on two elements. You can probably see here that this is the old shutter release, mechanical shutter release, cable release screw. You have to trim a little bit of the corner off of it. It still can function fine. It doesn't affect its functionality, but it is a little bit of a defacement of that element on the lens shutter. And then the other thing you have to do is you have to also shave the edge off of your flash sync port of this lens only. And you just have to go in there with a file or a Dremel with a cutoff wheel and just very slowly file it away until these two fit together just fine. Once the two shutters fit together on this lens board, you've done enough. So these require a little bit more work than kind of like the Compur Zero Graph-Flex shutters. They probably require the most work, these Seiko Fujinons. The Seiko Horseman shutters also require a little bit of modification, not quite as much as this. But both of those shutters, all three of those shutters, use the generic Zero lens board, which is this one. And the last thing I want to mention is this is true for all shutters except Mamiya TLRs, is that once you've got them assembled and tested, and field tested, go out and shoot some stuff, and everything's adjusted right, everything's coming out perfectly, is working great. You want to kind of permanentize your lens board, and what that means is this: these are, as I mentioned, tightened with a spanner wrench. You hold the front of the shutter and you tighten with the spanner wrench until you get the retaining ring as tight as possible. But it's very, very difficult to get it completely, at ultimate tightness. And for that reason, you can do it. You can do it, get it as tight as you want and leave it at that. But I recommend, once you've tested everything and it's working well, to add a little bit of hot glue to the side of your retaining ring. All right. I don't know if you can see that here. I've added a little bit of hot glue right along the side. You don't want to get it against the threads, the back threads of your shutter. So you want to make sure it's safely, basically in this gap between the outer edge of your retaining ring and the outermost gap of that indented circle in the back of your lens board. That's where you want to put the hot glue. I'd recommend using black hot glue, but that's up to you. But black hot glue, is less likely to reflect any stray light or anything. So just go in there, do that without, take your rear element out so there's no lens there, and just get in there and get some hot glue along there. How much is up to you. You could start with a little bit. If it ever breaks free, you can go back and put more. But when you're operating these lenses, you're going to be cocking them, and that can take a fair amount of force. And over time, it could, if you kind of it loosens a little bit, your retaining ring, your lens could shift a little. And if it shifts a little, it's going to, you guessed it, change the distance between the shutter lever and the piston here of your solenoid. And as we already know, adjusting that distance can affect the lens. So if your lens turns a little bit, it could cause it not to fire or something. So you don't want that. Again, the Mamiya TLR lenses have that little notch that holds them in place, but these other lens boards have to be compatible with a wide range of different shutters from different eras and different lenses. And as a result, we keep the notch out. So you have to, if there is a little screw, a little retaining screw in the back of your shutter, if it's not a Mamiya TLR shutter, you've got to remove that screw, because that screw will cause it not to sit level. So you've got to remove that screw from the back. That's in our instructions as well. But without that screw and without a notch, it's possible to turn freely. So you've got to get it quite tight, and then you also, ideally, just to be safe, add that little bit of hot glue, which will lock it in place and make sure nothing ever rotates on your lens board. That's my recommendation. You don't have to do it. You can just make it tight and it should be fine. But if you really want it to be rock solid, add that little bit of hot glue in there. Hot glue can be peeled off if you want to take the shutter out of the lens board. It could be a little bit difficult, but you know, as long as you didn't get it on the threads of the back of the shutter, it's a pretty good fail-safe that can be peeled off and removed if necessary. So that's it. That's how you assemble your lens board. For any other little details about modifications to particular types of shutters, close-up details in photos, etc., just read our full guide. But this has hopefully been helpful, not only as an overview and as a comparison, but to be able to see some of the motion and especially how to adjust those wires to be perfect. I've gone through that a number of times, but most thoroughly in the Copal 0 section of this video. So that's it. You are now ready to mount that lens board on your Stereo 12 and start shooting.